Hi Yogi, and welcome to another Asana Lab with me, Oceana. In today's episode, I'll be dissecting high plank and Chaturanga Dandasana. As always, I will be, of course, breaking down the intentions of the pose, the anatomy, the alignment, some modifications for common health conditions and injuries, as well as a few variations that you're very likely to encounter in your regular classes. I've decided to combine these two postures because it's quite tricky to talk about one of them without at least mentioning the other. So as a result, of course, I'll leave some timestamps in the video description in case you wanted to hop around a few different parts. Essentially, we'll dive right into, of course, the intentions of the pose. And realistically, both high plank and Chaturanga are predominantly front body strengtheners. So, of course, it strengthens the wrists, the forearms, upper arms, your shoulder joint. If you're doing correct alignment, you'll also be strengthening the muscles in the core of the body here. So predominantly, of course, your abdominals, but also very importantly, your TVA, your transverse abdominis. Transverse because it traverses the upper body into the lower body and connects them together. And that, of course, becomes really important when we come into our balancing postures, or in a more advanced practice, our inversions as well, so that we have that stability, because somehow we need to connect the lower and upper body. Again, with correct alignment, you're also engaging the serratus anterior, which is often referred to as the shoulder stabilizing muscle, because it comes from the lower part of the shoulder blade and wraps all the way along the rib cage and connects into the side ribs here. In my opinion, really one of the most important aspects of plank and Chaturanga is that it's one of the main places where you're going to learn how to find that connection of your front and back body, and the importance of understanding that connection as well, in order to find stability. I think a lot of times, because of the way we live, we're always looking at screens which are right in front of us. We're always walking forwards. We rarely walk backwards. We're rarely even turning to look back. So we're always in this sort of forward motion, and we spend a lot of time looking and thinking about the front of the body. We rarely pay that same attention to the back of the body unless we're developing back pain or injuries. So I think it's very important to actually understand that the two things are very, very interrelated, and the more you can sort of connect into that front body connection, the better your practice overall will be for it. It really sort of factors into a lot of the very advanced postures as well as the most basic ones. And then I think I couldn't really make this video without addressing the sort of elephant in the Chaturanga room. And that is that a lot of yoga teachers tend to sort of blame Chaturanga for every single rotator cuff injury that has ever happened in the history of yoga. And I will say that there is a proportionately high amount of rotator cuff injuries in the yoga discipline compared to other movement practices where people are doing push-ups all the time, sometimes hundreds of push-ups in an hour, if you look at CrossFit championships. And my personal hunch is that while I think it is very much possible to, of course, injure and damage the health of your shoulder through bad Chaturanga alignment, I don't personally believe that it is the main culprit. I will talk about that in a different video. But essentially, I do agree that for the most part, we are doing too many vinyasas, which is a sort of series of movements that we do in vinyasa flow yoga in order to link asymmetrical postures. And there is a different aspect to the vinyasa that I think is much more damaging to the shoulder joint. And as I said, when I talk about vinyasas as a separate topic, I will talk about that. And I think part of the thing we need to understand in order to really appreciate the safety and health of our shoulders is how specific and strange of a joint it is in many ways. It's a very complicated joint here. So I'll talk a little bit about the basic anatomy of the shoulder. As you may already know, in the body, you often have a very mobile joint, such as the shoulder, that is then contrasted afterwards, with the next joint being much more stable. So with the shoulder, you then have here the elbow, which really only moves in two directions, whereas the shoulder has all of this freedom of movement. And you also have the thoracic spine, which is very much sort of locked in by the rib cage. The thing about the shoulder being so mobile, of course, again, you might already know that it is a ball and socket joint, which means that the humerus, your upper arm bone, forms a sort of ball bearing at the top. And then at the very outer edge of your collarbone, you've got a socket that wraps around it and sort of holds the humerus in place. The other main ball and socket joint in the human body is, of course, the hip joint. And it's really interesting to contrast these two joints in order to understand why the shoulder is so strange of a joint. So in the hip joint, you're very, very unlikely to have a dislocation. It only really happens when you're very young, let's say in your 20s, when you have very, very high bone density. And if you were, for example, a high-level gymnast or cheerleader who jumps from very high altitudes into a full front split position, and then you may dislocate your thigh bone from your hip joint. Otherwise, most of us are more likely to break our thigh bone than to dislocate that joint. And that is because the hip ball and socket joint, the socket actually wraps around the thigh bone and probably covers around, I would say, 70 to 80% of that ball joint at the top. The shoulder joint, by contrast, I would say that shoulder dislocation is fairly common. And that is because the socket here only covers around maybe 40% of the ball of the humerus or upper arm bone. And that, of course, means that when you compare the hip joint, the hip ball and socket would still be connected even if there was no muscle to hold it in place. That is not the case for the shoulder necessarily. So, I mean, it depends a little bit about your individual bone structure, but for the most part, you really do need the muscles in the arm and shoulder in order to make that connection, make it a safe and strong connection as well. So my personal sort of rule of thumb for any posture where you're bearing weight on your hands and by conclusion also your shoulders is that you really want to aim for as much stability in the shoulder joint as you possibly can. In Chaturanga, the thing you really want to emphasize, and in a high plank actually, is that you are spinning the inside of your elbow forward as much as possible so that your shoulder goes into an external rotation, which is going to activate your serratus anterior, that very fun muscle we discussed earlier, which then draws your shoulder blade down and back and connects it more into the rib cage and allows the shoulder blade to lie flat on top of the rib cage. If you ever notice yourself in a high plank that your shoulders are winging up and there's a big gap between the shoulder blade and your rib cage or spine below it, then that is usually a sign that you really need to strengthen the shoulder blade attachment muscles. And oftentimes one of the reasons people injure their shoulders in yoga practice, in my opinion as well, is because yoga unfortunately has a lot of pushing movements, but we don't have a lot of pulling movements. So we really need to balance out the shoulders by doing maybe some indoor climbing, outdoor climbing, maybe some weightlifting, maybe working with resistance bands, which is quite a cheap and good option to get that pulling action going, so that we balance out the muscles that support a healthy shoulder, and also, enable all of our shoulder movements to be stronger and better in the long run. So with all of that in mind, of course, we will talk about the alignment here. So essentially, we always want to find our high plank alignment from our tabletop position. And essentially you want your hands to be shoulder distance so that you stack your shoulders directly on top of the wrists. Index fingers pointing forward. I'm engaging my Hasta Bandha, and if you have not seen how to engage your hands properly, I'll pop that video somewhere in the video so it links you to it. And then from here, as I said, the inner elbows are trying to spin forward to point to the front of the mat. But as you can tell, I've already got a bit of hyperextension going in my elbow. So I'm going to think about unlocking this joint so that I'm not just hanging in my elbow joint, I'm actually engaging the muscles around it. And then I'm thinking very actively about drawing my front hip points to my lower rib cage so that I'm almost hollowing out the front of the body. If you are a gymnast, then you will know this as dish shape. So that's what you're trying to create here. And that is how A, we're engaging the TVA, but B, we're also finding that connection of the front muscles to the back body muscles and protecting the lower back and creating stability. Crown of the head is reaching forward, so we're lengthening the neck as part of the spine. And from here, knees hip distance, I'm going to tuck one set of toes under at a time and find my high plank. Shoulders and hips are hopefully in line as well. And in terms of coming into Chaturanga from here, I simply press through my feet to come onto my big toes and then bend the elbows until they come into my rib cage. And ideally, when you bend your elbows, you want your elbow to stay on top of the wrist so that the shoulder slightly tracks forward. I will say that some teachers do not like to teach their Chaturangas with that forward movement. My personal opinion is that as I teach Chaturanga as part of a vinyasa flow, I want my students to come forward onto their big toes before they lower down, because then once they lower down, they're going to go into an upward facing jog and need to roll over their toes or at least untuck their toes. So I want to make that easier for them by already bringing them onto the big toes to begin with. Secondly, I think a lot of the teachers who don't like that forward movement is because they start to see a lot of their students round their shoulders forward and up to their ears or collapsing into their chest. And I personally think that if that's happening, it's really because the shoulder joint isn't strong enough yet to support that full movement, and those students really need to modify. A couple of other common misalignments, we'll just tick them off the list here. So other common things that I see are that, of course, yes, there's that sort of rounding of the shoulders coming forward. And really we want to maintain an open chest as we come into Chaturanga. But I often also see that people's hips in a high plank will already be too low. And then as they come down through Chaturanga, their hips touch the floor before their chest does. And in my opinion, that is really a weakness in the core body here. So we would have to strengthen those muscles and do a modification to do that. Or I see people trying to compensate for a lack of core strength by lifting their hips too high. So when they come down, the chest ends up touching the floor before their hips do. So whenever you are practicing without a teacher, it's very helpful to use the floor and your mat as a way of getting feedback about your Chaturangas. Chaturanga Dandasana translates from Sanskrit as four-limbed staff pose. And the danda is a staff, one long stick. So you're trying to emulate that. And your entire body wants to really come down at the same time as much as possible. Of course, we will have slightly different proportions. So these things aren't always hard and fast rules. In my personal experience, if you have any of these misalignments going on, the only way to fix them is to dial in your ego and lower down via the knees in order to gradually build up your strength so that then you can do it with perfect execution, maintaining the health and safety of your shoulder joint. And that for me really means that, of course you can do your high plank with the knees on the floor, but you could also be in a normal high plank and then from here, lower the knees down, still engaging the front of the body. I'm untucking the toes so that I can control my descent and then press back up. And of course, I can do that as part of a vinyasa as well. If you're still working on that strength and the full movement is a bit much, you could also use some books or bricks and I tend to grip them here with my index finger and thumb. And again, I'm coming into that slightly longer tabletop here. I'm going to bring my shoulders on top of the wrists and then bend the elbows into my rib cage until I tap down on top of these bricks and then pressing back up. And that's a great way to gradually build up that strength. Now, another way to slowly find your full chaturanga is to have your bolster, or a couple of pillows will work as well. Place it the long way on your mat. And from here, you can again find your high plank. And tucking the elbows in, you're traveling forward onto your big toes, slowly lower down. You can even have a little bit of a rest on your bolster here, and then connect into your body to press up again. So that's a good option as well if you're slowly building up that strength. And also with that, the awareness. So if the only times that those are not really appropriate is when you have wrist issues going on. In that case, I think one thing that helps to take a little bit of the weight and pressure out of your wrists is to elevate your hands slightly higher. And again, that can be a really good option if you're gradually working your way towards full chaturanga. So for some people, simply elevating the hands on top of their bricks a little bit higher can help. For other people, they need a lot more elevation, such as hands on a chair, hands on a bench, hands on the steps on a staircase. So I'll demonstrate that just briefly here. I'm going to place my hands on top of this little ledge. I'm going to find my full high plank. Gaze goes forward, and I'm slowly going to travel down, tucking my elbows into the chest and then pressing up again. And as you get more confident, as your strength builds up, you can slowly start to decrease the angle until you're in a perfect chaturanga. And you'll have gradually built your way there. So that's another great option. Now, in terms of variations that you might encounter, of course, as I said, the knees down and moving forward in a straight line is a great option. The other one that I would like to dispel as a variation of chaturanga is knees, chest, chin, Ashtanga Namaskara. So if you've never done it before, then essentially from a sort of long tabletop, people stick out their bums and then you're tucking the elbows in and you're drawing the chest and chin towards the floor into an arched spine position, and then often you would slide your chest through into a cobra pose. It's not really a suitable way to build up strength towards chaturanga, and I think it trains very different muscles and movements. So in my personal opinion, it's only really appropriate for classes where you're really working towards back bending rather than strengthening, which is chaturanga. And then most commonly in classes, I would say you will find a 3-point plank and chaturanga, which oftentimes, and I like to teach this as well actually because it sort of challenges our strength a little bit. We would come into this from a 3-legged dog and we would move forward into a 3-point plank and then bend at the elbow into chaturanga. And we would do the same thing on the second side. And I'd say the other option here is as well to, similar to balancing tabletop, you can do balancing high plank, lifting opposite arm to leg on both sides, which is challenging your balance but also strengthening. And of course, there's many ways to vary your high planks. Mainly, you could change the alignment of your feet and hands. So you could have the hands outside of the mat with the fingertips pointing apart, for instance. You could walk the hands and feet away from each other so you come lower towards the floor, which again is slightly more challenging here. You could also have the hands really close together and the fingertips pointing out. There's a lot of different ways to vary in that sense. But those are sort of the main ones. And of course there's tiger's curl, which is, I guess, slightly different, but again, we would come into it from a three-legged dog, and from there we draw the knee in towards the nose, or we might have the knee towards one elbow, maybe even sliding the knee down and then drawing it all the way up towards the armpit. But again, working more towards strength there. And I think those are sort of the main points. Of course, if I've left anything out, if you have questions, pop them in the comment section down below. Leave your suggestions and feedback there as well. And if you want to find me anywhere else online, all of that information is in the video description. If you like the video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, share it with your friends and spread the good word. And hopefully I will see you back on the mat very soon, Yogi. Thank you so much for joining me today. Bye.